Okay, we are live. So, hello, my name is Colin, and welcome to episode 20 of Roll by Roll's Tavern Talk, a show where we, the Roll by Roll gang, discuss various aspects of running a great D&D campaign based on our experiences with D&D 5e and our current adventures in Emathan homebrew campaign. Joining me tonight is the rest of the Roll by Roll crew. We have Barry, who plays Nightingale and Landis.
Hey everybody.
We have Egan, who plays Douglin.
Hello.
I don't know where we are in the overlay. I'm just looking at like our screen. I'm like, on the overlay, I'm probably pointing. I'm at the bottom, I think, normally.
Yeah, you're bottom right. So
There. Oh, okay.
yeah,
Max is the bottom. Anyway,
and,
moving on.
we have Max, who plays Kogon.
Right.
All right, guys. So tonight's topic is one I think we've batted this one around a few times. So we decided tonight is the night to dig into it. We are going to look at the use of maps and minis or tokens, depending on whether it's physical or electronic, versus theater of the mind, which is, I believe, the long-running way to run combat. So, I know doing a little reading myself on this seems to be one of the things that the D&D community is really capable of getting itself wound up about. So we'll see if we can keep it civilized here in the tavern for our discussion. So kick this one off to kind of set the tone, kind of have an understanding of what everybody's experience and preference is, maybe for the two. We'll start off with the question: what is your preference and experience which each of these combat styles? So maps, theater of the mind, or maybe both, if you have a preference or whatever. So Max, I know you're very passionate about this topic. So why don't you start us off?
Sure. I'm very passionate because I have a twist of philosophy that we can get into a little later. But
Cool.
to start with your primary question, um, I typically use a combination of both, but I will definitely say I prefer what we're currently calling theater of the mind. But again, little twist on that coming down the pipe. Um, but yeah, I use both. I think a lot of the time players like a board and or a screen or whatever you're using. Um, but yeah, I don't want to get too far into that. But yeah, so I typically use a combination of both. I don't mind either. Prefer more of the theater of the mind stuff. I think it allows for greater flexibility and on the fly sort of situations. But both have their place by all means, and I encourage a mixture of both. So.
Cool. Egan, why don't you go next?
Yeah, a lot of what Max said, I like a little bit of both. I think even with tokens, there's still a lot of theater of the mind that comes into play. I think from a structure standpoint, and 5e I know got away from the uber structure of the previous edition. But there is some, formula, some mechanics, some things that are sort of need to adhere to, and miniatures and maps help that along. 30 feet of movement, etc. Can it all be done theater of the mind? 100%, 100%. But if you were to ask me, I do like the combination to where you have a board. We have ours virtually. We have the tokens virtually. I think it helps a lot. I do know it probably drives DM crazy trying to find the right map for the scene if it's not in a prepackaged like ours, which is a homebrew. But I'm going to say a combination of both because I know there's still a lot of theater of the mind left, even with tokens and maps.
Barry?
So I started solely theater of the mind and a pad of graph paper, and I think that's where a lot of us players who started off Dungeons and Dragons, it was generally, a couple of books and a pad of graph paper, and that's all you had to go on. There weren't maps, there weren't miniatures at that point that any of us could afford. So that was my initial introduction, was all just in the imagination. Um, I find both can be useful. I think people tend to lean too heavily nowadays on needing maps and miniatures in order to that's how they believe the game has to be experienced. And I think a lot of that comes from video game, right? If they can't see what they're doing, they don't quite understand what they're doing. Now, like Egan mentioned, there's a lot of mechanics that become mute if you don't have a map to use. Like movements and cover and things like that. Like how do you play that when you don't have a map and you can't see the terrain and things like that? But, personally, it's cool, it looks cool, but I could do without, like I grew up playing with it in my imagination. I don't generally play a game that leans heavily on the combat side. So combat being basic and more imagination is fine with me. I'm not strategically placing myself very often. I do when we play our game because I can see a map, and so I'm going to take advantage of all the things that does. But for me, it doesn't matter. I could go completely without and still have just as fun a time.
For myself, I mean, obviously Barry and I were we started playing D&D together when we were kids, and when we first started, I didn't even like theater of the mind was the way you played. We didn't even know that there was the possibility of using maps and such. The first time it occurred to me that you could use a map and tokens, I got the Star Frontiers box set, and it came with this big, huge map and all these little like 1 centimeter square tokens that you could put on this grid. And be honest with you, I thought to myself, this is this is awesome. Why didn't I think about this before? Having a map and being able to put stuff on it. And um, for me, I say both, but based on the situation for me. So my go-to is absolutely maps and tokens. There are so many game mechanics that are really difficult to utilize without having a good spatial reference. I'm not saying that's better or worse, but it is just unfortunate. It's the facts. It's really hard to say, oh well, this spell has a 30-foot range. Am I 30 or 35 feet away, right? So depending on how much you lean into that particular game's mechanics, I mean, we're talking about D&D, but I mean, depending on the type of system you're using, some don't have a lot of combat mechanics, so they really lend themselves to theater of the mind better than, say, D&D does. Um, Egan, you talked about 4E. I mean, you pretty much couldn't play 4E if you didn't have maps and tokens, because it really leaned heavily into game mechanics. So there's a lot at play there, and we'll get into the details of it a little bit more. I do like both. I think they do have there, but my preference is to use maps and tokens because I like seeing the terrain. I like the fact that people can interact with it. So we'll kind of go right into question number 2 here. We'll start off with maps and minis, or maps and tokens, depending on if you're in the physical, or I guess minis are even in the electronic world. But we'll start off there and maybe talk a little bit about what you see as the pros and cons of that particular method of running combat. So, Max, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, obvious pros are if you're playing heavily. I'll say I'm going to direct my stuff more towards combat because I think that's where typically it's being
Yeah.
used.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it allows you to take full tactical advantage of all the mechanics of the game, right? And I think if your group is, more combat centric than anything, that's what they get the most kicks from playing D&D, then you should probably absolutely use maps and minis 90% of the time. You know what I mean? Um, and cons, I think you could start to get too bogged down by mechanics
Yeah.
in the sense of you start to lose the creativity, and a dungeon master might start to lose sight of the fact that the rules are just guidelines. They're not necessary to be played set in stone. Um, and I think you can start to, yeah, hinder creativity at the table a little bit. And you also start to play maybe a bit of an even if it's just subconsciously, a bit of an optimized game, because now you're analyzing everything that's going on and you're less playing from the heart and character of the situation, and more like, how do I do best at this, you know? Uh yeah, I think that's where I'll cut her short. I could keep going.
It was good. It was good.
Yeah,
All
I think
right.
that's the major points though. That's my major
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Sure.
Egan?
Yeah, we had before the show tell Max that he needed to keep it under 20 minutes each comment. So
Yeah,
Well,
when we get to part three, then I'll
yeah, we'll have a director's cut that we'll put online down the
Yeah.
road. But
Straight to DVD.
yeah,
the Zack Snyder
Um,
edition.
for me, pros and cons. First of all, I've grown up with minis, and as Barry said, theater of the mind. But even that theater of the mind, my first experiences were with minis, and I had the fortune to have a brother that loved to paint minis. We had hundreds, and he painted them all. So when you have like a little dwarf fighter with a shield and a axe that's all detailed out, and you put those down, and there really wasn't a map. You just put it down on the table, and the DM would bring out another mini. Um, to me, there's a lot of pros to that, because now you sort of have an ownership to go along with the theater of the mind. Like, that's my guy right there. And in the early days, you weren't that technical. There was no, oh, I'm 30 feet away. The DM would make a call. Yeah, you can hit him. No problem. Yeah, you can move over here. No problem. It wasn't as structured. As you said, it was more creative and from the heart. So I think there's a lot of pluses to the tokens and the miniatures. And now in a virtual world, the same thing. We decorate our tokens, we go online, and you can, find the right image that works for you. And there's some people out there that even, do their own. So I think there's a place for that. And I think there's a big plus to the tokens. The negative, I'm going to say, because we had a big long break and I'm constantly searching for games. I sometimes think that to have all of these virtual tabletops, or you can't play, doesn't seem right. Like, you literally could just get on a Zoom right now and we can start playing.
Yep.
I mean, we don't need a virtual tabletop. We don't need a map. We don't need a mini. We need dice. That's it. And even then you can probably get something online. So the negative for me is this: it seems like you think you only can play if you have all of those programs, those minis and all that stuff. When the fact is you don't. You just need people. That's it. Like-minded people that want to have a good time. So that would be my negative, is that we feel, a lot of us feel the need to have all those in order to play, and I don't think you do.
Barry?
This is kind of one of those chicken and the egg things, except that I know which one came first. So when I
Please,
look
please
back at,
enlighten us.
here we go, guys. Here we go. When I look back at the first sessions and the first campaigns we would play, it was more storytelling than mechanics. Mechanics didn't exist. You wanted to cast magic missile, you cast magic missile. So, as far as needing to know ranges and things like that, I don't even think it listed. Now, I could be wrong.
No,
It could have
it
had
did.
ranges,
It did.
but like, to me, it was more about just the epicness of what was going on than whether or not they were within range. So it was more exciting almost to me, that style of combat, than, oh, I can't hit him because he's behind that person. Like, wow, that sucks. You know. Now, do I think minis and stuff has a place? Well, yeah, yeah. Like I have two young children and they grew up on video games. So for them, they love minis and maps. Like that just as soon as they see me start whipping out the maps and the minis, they just lose their minds and are super excited. Now, a drawback to all of this to me, or the major drawback, is cost for one thing. Like they are expensive. You know, not only now are you spending $60 a book, but now you're trying to buy minis and maps and terrain. And you know, it just begins to become this game that financially is out of people's price range, right? You know, like the way they think it has to be played. If you watch many of these shows, they've got custom built minis for them. And so that's the idea that people think you need. So, you know, that's a big drawback. There are cheaper ways to do it. Like I purchased a product from I think it's 1984. It's all 2D minis. And you got to cut them out yourself. It's paper. It's way back to like the Star Frontiers days, man. It's just like little paper representations and it works. But you know, like I get that as the game has increased in mechanics, it becomes more and more important to have these kinds of things. But is that a self, you know, fulfilling system that they've created now that, oh, we're going to add more mechanics. So now you need all of these measurement props in order to play. And like, at what point do you just say, no, stop? Like, enough with the mechanics because you're removing the fantasy from this now and it's become a mechanics game, you know? And I worry that people get caught up in having to have the latest and the greatest. And, you know, like, no, you don't need any of it to have a fantastic games. And like Colin, I think you said there are other RPGs and tabletop games that have very basic combat mechanics, and you can still have a hell of a good time playing it. So to me, it's a cool little gimmick that I think is fun. And if it's there, I'll use it. If someone else wants to buy $3,000 worth of minis, yeah, I'll play with your toys. What kid doesn't, right? But do I think I need them? Nah, yeah, you know, not really.
For myself, you know, in terms of pros, I think that it's a lot easier to visualize the area that the combat is taking place, and you know, so that helps some people better interact with that terrain that it's because in you know, and we'll get into the pros and cons of theater of the mind, but Theater of the Mind leans heavily on the DM doing a good job of describing what's going on. And if you don't have an experienced DM, you know, it may be difficult for the group to understand the environment they're working or they're in if they can't visualize it. We talked already around, you know, in terms of pros, it does, you know, it does allow you, I think Max you talked about this, does allow you to utilize the mechanics of the game better. So, you know, things like movement and your weapon and your spell ranges, cover, flanking, that sort of thing. So if you're a group that, you know, really enjoys that part of the game, um, you're probably going to find maps and minis uh, lean into that a little better. In terms of cons, Barry, you touched on this one already. I mean, it takes time and money to prepare the maps, you know, depending on how simple or complex, physical or electronic, whatever, you know, but that still requires a time commitment, especially from a GM standpoint in prepping for your game. Now you're getting maps ready and tokens ready and stuff like that. And it can also limit the area where the battle takes place, right? So you've got a kind of a fixed area on this map you're playing in. You know, so sometimes you might feel like you can't move beyond that area that's shown on that map while you're doing your combat, right? Um, so we'll move on to what are the pros and cons of Theater of the Mind. So Max,
Okay, twist time. All right.
twist time.
Okay, so the reason I don't like the term theater of the mind. Okay, and I think it the reason is because it conjures up this image, I guess, of needing to mentally envision and keep track of a virtual board in your brain. Okay. And I think that's part of the problem and the turnoff of why a lot of people kind of fade away from it and just go to the more physical. And I think the approach for non concrete sort of combat should be more of a thought of just what you do with every other DMing situation that doesn't use a board, and that's presenting a situation and giving choice. That's really combat is the exact same thing as every other thing in D&D, only it has another specific set and probably an exploded array of tools to deal with it because it is a very fun and intricate part of the game. But you could still run meaningful combat by just presenting choices, you know? Like your negotiation with the white dragon has failed. You're all standing at the mouth of the cave. It's readying its icy breath weapon. You can see the glow deep in its throat. What do? You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if they're 30 or 40 feet away. You know, it's in the cave. You're at the mouth. You know, you could jump out of the way. I brandish my weapon. I charge in. You know, like there's all sorts of things that can be fun and meaningful and you can allow for situations. And if you wanted to do a hybrid, you could do like just have a couple things on a table just for some general sense of what's going on. Do you know what I mean? It doesn't have to be super detailed, and that might help bridge the gap. But I think, yeah, theater of the mind should be a term that's become so popular that needs to get kind of tossed out the window a little bit and just think of more of a combat choices.
Let's rebrand it.
Yeah, set the scene and provide choice. That's really what's happening. And you can still you don't have to have like exact measurements, but you can use like so we know like a basic movement is roughly 30 feet. Do we need 30 feet to say that or anything like that? You can be like, this person's in range. You can move up and attack. Oh, but that archer in the back, you're gonna have to dash to get to them. What do you decide to do? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
it just needs to be like that, you know? So anyways, that's my thoughts on Theater of the Mind. Are there pros and cons? Yeah, of course. You know what I mean? They're just kind of the opposites of what we've talked about with the concrete stuff. But I think if you just think of the fact that you don't need to be visualizing a board, just presenting choices, that kind of alleviates this sort of like comparison to physical boards and things like that and virtual boards and stuff. So that's my twist.
I like
E-
it.
Egan?
I can't wait for Max to run a game for us. Um, Pros and cons. I think the pros of theater of the mind or establishing choices, via descriptive words versus maps and minis and whatnot, is I think it going into sort of like development of people, young kids. It gives you a chance to think abstractly. It sort of pushes the limits of getting out of just sort of input output, right? You're mixing it yourself. You're creating that and then sharing it. It's a form of art, if you want to be honest. And I think that's a great thing for, any age, to be honest with you, but especially the younger days. I just remember what it felt for me. A lot of kids, they're maybe not as socially, comfortable. This gives them a chance to kind of blossom and come out and show a lot of people what they have going on in their head. The negative or the cons to that is that not everybody has that desire to be creative. Some just want to kind of roll the dice and, video game style, as Barry said, they just, want to have a good time and they don't want to put themselves out there. So I think with the games that we play, though, we are lucky to have both because there are many situations where we don't use anything on fantasy grounds. We are just talking, we're creating. And, I remember Colin had a situation where we saw somebody, so we bunkered into a hotel in the inn, and he ended up not having the character attack us. So that was all theater of the mind. There was no map, there was no mini, it was just all through our head and how we created the situation. So we haven't let go of it. I think we're still very much involved with theater of the mind. But I think, as Max said, combat does seem to fall back into that. But I'm okay with that balance. I think it gives us all we want, and I look forward to all the games and sessions that we have.
Barry?
They're all great points, great cons, like as you say, if you don't have people with creative imaginations, theater of the mind is a place they will struggle. Like, but I put it to you guys this way. When you read a novel, you picture it in your head and it's epic. And then if someone makes that movie, how often do they capture how
Yeah.
epically you saw it in your mind, right? Very, very few times, if ever. They might get a few things where you're like, yeah, okay, that's kind of the way I envisioned it. But so for me, when you bring a mini, you now have an idea of what that character looks like. So your imagination is now only going to bring up that object, right? So for me, theater of mind just makes the world whatever you want it to be. Even though the DM is describing the world the way he wants it to be, you're going to see it the way you want to see it. So it's almost like catering more to the individual through through let's say active visualization over theater of the mind, right? To me, it offers you like I never ever struggled with picturing what my character looked like, what monsters looked like. If I saw like I remember the Dungeons and Dragons first monster manual, they were very basic pictures, but they gave you kind of an idea to go on. So, and then you just built it up and added in the details yourself. So for me, those are the major pros for that style of play, for active imagination instead of concrete and physical objects. It allows you to just like flex that muscle. And I know a lot of people in this or just a lot of people struggle in that area, so I can understand that being something that would turn them off trying to visualize everything. Now, I agree with you, Max. A lot of people think when this term comes up, you've got to remember this board in your head. But I think that's just because that's how they've seen it played. And
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
when they think of that term, oh, so we're just not using a board. I've got to try to vision it up here. No, 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 you don't. You don't worry about trying to strategically play yourself. Tell the DM what you want to do, and he will say whether or not you can do
Yeah.
that.
Exactly.
So, in that regard, the possibilities are endless. You're not stuck with the mechanics of what your fighter can do. I want my fighter to run up and he jumps off another guy's back and he comes down with his axe and swing. The DM would be roll. If you hit it, bang, that's what you did. I didn't need a special feat to do that. I didn't need. So, it's more freeing in my mind. It's more exciting. It allows me to visualize the stuff the way I want to see it in the environments. But yes, it does require a lot more work on the DM side to kind of paint that picture using words. But is that a bad thing? Like it seems the game is trying to get, I'm getting off topic here, but it
No,
seems
no.
like it's the game's getting more and more set in stone. This is how this it looks. This is how this spell works. This is the rules you're supposed to go. And you're losing that creative freedom. Like, oh, I don't have that power. Well, who cares if you don't have the power? Try it anyway. You know what I mean? Go ahead, Max. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may. Um, I agree with you 100%. And I think to be fair, I think most DMs and tables welcome that creativity on physical board or virtual tabletop. It's just we're less inclined to have our brains go there because we're focused on what's presented before us. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? So like I think that's what it is mostly is this a little bit of a degradation of yeah, your creativity,
The
which
free creativity that
yeah,
used to be there
exactly.
with that style
Yeah.
of play.
So,
So, I'm gonna I'm gonna disagree with both of you a little bit because
mhm.
I don't think that gets lost if you choose not to lose it. For me, I
Exactly.
it's no less almost I guess a hybrid to me when I play. I don't I don't visualize it any less when there's a board than I would if we were just playing Theater of the Mind. For me, that board is really just about making it a little bit easier to tell where people are, what game mechanics work. Now if you were a group and you just said, you know what, we're like sort of what you're referring to, Barry. You know what, the game mechanics aren't that important to us. We just want to play where we're really just doing the things we want to do. I mean, if that's the choice the group makes, you're not that worried about the game mechanics or playing, fighters the way 5e says they are or whatever, then that's great. I mean, you can play the game that way. But for people who want to play with the game mechanics, and
Oh yeah.
and there are people who if you go on social media, there's, as with all things, there's people that lose their mind if you, Barry, if you were even to say, oh well, you don't have to do that just because it's a game mechanic. Like
Oh, yeah.
they'd be flailing arms and they're losing their minds, right? So, but I mean, as long as the group makes that decision as to, we're going to play Theater of the Mind, we're going to be loose and fast with the rules because we just want to tell an epic story, then awesome, go for it and do that if that's the thing that you're looking for, right? For me, um, you know, in terms of pros, it's very easy to set up and use, especially if a combat comes around that's unexpected. If you're stuck on using maps too much, I think, a DM might even have a tendency to try and avoid unexpected combats because they're
Yep.
not quote unquote ready for it with the maps and the minis and all the rest. So that might curtail creativity a little bit. I can
Yeah.
definitely see that. Um,
Railroaded because of prep.
yeah, it's like, oh well, I'm not ready for that, so you guys are not going to be able to do that, right? So, obviously, no cost with Theater of the Mind, which is fantastic. Um, in terms of cons, uh, Theater of the Mind gets increasingly more difficult to do the more people that are involved in the group. Like if you had a really large group, and that's just because it starts to get a little difficult for everybody to interact, where we don't really have a reference point, right? Um, it does this is only mildly a con because it is something you can deal with, but it does require everyone to have that good understanding of how are we going to deal with the combat mechanics in an on-scene environment. So as long as those discussions are had, that's not as much of a con. But if you have somebody that's new to the group or not used to the way you deal with mechanics in this virtual environment, or in this Theater of the Mind environment, but it's easy to get around that. One thing that I did find interesting when I was doing my research for this, I found a couple of different people talked about people who are visual learners love maps and minis. Generally if they're polled, and I also found out I'd heard this term before, and there's actually people who cannot picture things in their minds. It's called aphantasia. So they have no ability to picture things in their mind whatsoever, and they really struggle in Theater of the Mind situations. Now, Max, you already said, I mean, depending on how you play it, it can be less about paint the picture and more about just tell me what you're going to do, right? I mean,
Presentation
again,
of choice. Yeah.
yeah, you can get around that, but I thought that's interesting because if you are a Theater of the Mind group and you're leaning heavily into painting a picture in everybody's mind, that's a good little point to be aware of. You might actually have people who can't do that, right? So, okay, let's get some final thoughts here. Who could believe it's already 35 minutes into one of our discussions? But Max, give us your last thoughts on today's topic.
Okay, my last thoughts. With untheater of the mind, trying to ban a term, but it's. I should have mentioned one epic pro about it, and that is, and we've alluded to it already multiple times, is that you can be ready to go. It takes minimal effort. If you're a DM and uh you had a rough week and your prep is like, oh, I've got the basics of what I want to do, but man, I didn't prepare for this potential combat and have this scenery. You can just go and run it out. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You don't have to have those things, and just present the situation, and it can be tons of fun. And it'll good chance it'll go your conflict, yeah, will just be a different sort of interaction than what might have occurred. Someone might do something really interesting, and it might not even devolve it into a combat as much as just a new type of encounter. You know what I mean? And that's equally fun. um and then final thoughts on like game boards and virtual tabletops. As much as I have just talked about my preference for uh the theater of the mind stuff, I guess. Uh, it is still super fun to see a map brought up and see like when Colin brings those ones, and like there's sand blowing across the desert and fire flickering, and it can be very immersive. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It
The
really
war
can.
drums in the
Yeah,
back.
yeah. The
Roll
music
initiative.
and stuff. Like so. Like I said, I don't think anyone should just go hardline with any one choice. There's definitely room for both. If you save your epic combat moments, like say you prefer not to prep things, but you bust out that epic map for a final boss battle or something like that, man, people are gonna love it. You know what I mean? It's just one of those things. So, um, yeah, they're all great. They all have pros and cons, and it's really like we say every time with just about everything, it revolves around your group and their
Absolutely.
preferences and the
Yeah.
communication you have with them is
Yeah.
really where it goes. I
Yeah.
think what we like to talk about is being able to say that there are options, and you're
Yes.
not
Yeah.
you're not stuck in any one avenue, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Egan, your final thoughts?
Yeah, both Max and Barry had this advice, which is don't worry about the mechanics. During our break, I struggled to run a campaign, and I didn't have time to prep, and it long story short, it derailed, a night of adventuring that could have been probably better looked after if I had just, said, all right, I'm going to have a few things in my head and we'll figure it out. You'll probably have a lot of fun interactions, as they said, and who knows, it might just be the new way of doing things. But I would say when it comes to all of this, if you have the opportunity, try to lean one session that is just, without heavy maps or maybe just the big boss encounter, and see how it goes. Try it both ways. I mean, we've had the advantage of doing it both ways and loved both of them. Obviously, most of us fell in love before any of this virtual stuff came about. So, fond memories, if you will. But there's still many, many opportunities to do it nowadays. And if you are looking to start a group or looking for a group, try not to be intimidated without having the latest this, the latest that, and just even Discord and some dice. Trust me, you can have a fun
Absolutely.
game.
Yeah.
And then my last thought, because similar to Max, I'm going to go back and sort of 180 it. If that virtual tabletop that we saw teased for D&D 1 is going to come to fruition, that looks freaking awesome. I mean, it's like a 3D type of thing. So all bets are off when that thing hits.
Yeah.
It could just change the whole thing. But try everything, guys. Just play. That's all. That's my advice.
Barry.
Ugh, you guys. No, like I agree with you.
Yeah.
It all has its place, it all adds certain elements to the game. I would just personally stress that I find too many people lean heavily on needing the maps and minis. Like, don't stress out about it. Like Colin said, if you don't have it prepped, don't let that stop that from happening. You know? And along those same lines, it's same with, I was like, I liked how in the theater of the mind your characters could do anything. Always rule for cool, right? Like as a DM, don't get stuck on the rules. If someone wants to do something that their character might not have because you guys are playing a certain thing in theater of the mind, if it's cool, man, let them do it. Let them try to make up a role for it and then see how it happens. So, as final thoughts, don't pick one over the other. Like I lean one way, but that's my personal preference. Like they both have a place, they both add to the game in certain ways, and you don't need either one of them to have a good time. So, be open, find out the way you like to play, and then master that. If you're a thinker and you want to imagine, then you're going to run a game that you have more scenarios where it's all up in the air and you're visualizing it in your head and you're. But if you're someone who loves details and maps and you've got a creative spirit that way, dive into it, man, and just be good at it. Just put the time in and the effort in to be good at whatever way you like to play, and you'll have the game that you enjoy.
Yep.
Absolutely. So for myself, I think either of these methods can be really effective if the DM and the group are on board with using them and how you're going to use them, right? So if you're going to be a group, use lots of theater of the mind, talk about how that's going to work, and then use that. And if you're, Max, is sort of what you said, maybe you're a group that's heavy theater of the mind, but you whip out that map every now and then for something a little different. Or you may be the group that leans into using maps, but then you just pull out that theater of the mind, like Egan, you talked about in when we were in the inn and you met the one bounty hunter that was after Nightingale, right? We ran that as theater of the mind because for me, I if it's fairly, and this is a personal preference, I'll definitely preface it. If it's fairly simple in a fairly controlled environment, I think theater of the mind is fantastic for me personally. It's a great way to deal with that. I think that, like anything, as a DM, you need to get good at using both of them so that you have them in your toolkit to pull out at any time. So, you may not be great at maps and tokens to start. So maybe try that a little bit more. Maybe you're not good at theater of the mind when you start out. So try that a little bit more in your games because especially for the unexpected, having a fairly strong I'm pretty sure every time I say theater of the mind, I see Max cringe just a little bit. But having
No, no.
having strong theater of the mind skills opens up your ability to react to the unexpected better. Okay, this is a really good spot to have a combat here. We're just going to go for it. This is going to be theater of the mind, right? So it really lets you lean into every moment that's there, so that it works for whatever situation. So saves time, saves game prep. That's a good thing. Using a little more theater of the mind. So guys, we better wrap it up here.
Close to 45
We're
minutes.
yeah, we're getting on to 45 minutes here. So we'll call that a wrap for episode 20 of Roll by Roll's Tavern Talk. Hopefully, people have enjoyed tonight's topic and they don't lose their marbles over the whole thing. Obviously, we're a group of 4 people here, and we have very different thoughts around it. JD was here with us tonight. I didn't really get a chance to chat with
Hey,
him,
bud.
but hey, JD, nice to have you. Thanks for joining us. Tavern talks occur on the Thursdays after each of our Saturday night adventures in Emathan sessions. So our next session is scheduled for February 17th. So for those watching on YouTube, please support us by making sure to like our videos and subscribe to our channel. Hit that little bell icon so you'll be alerted when our next session occurs. So, end of the episode, we'll do as we always do. We'll offer each other and JD and everyone else a cheers. Thanks for joining us in the tavern, and we hope that you can join us again next time.
Combat encounter presentation.
There you
Not
go.
theater of the mind. Combat encounter presentation.
I like imaginative gaming,
There you go.
Yeah.
but it's all imaginative gaming, right?
Signing out.
Signing out.
Signing out. Thanks, guys. Next time.
Okay.